Property identity fraud generally involves properties that are on the market for rent because they're generally empty, and people can quite easily search a particular property on Rightmove or any property advertising site for tenants. And often what fraudsters will do is identify a property that's on the market for rent and then carry out a land registry search to find out whether or not the property has a mortgage on it. Generally, properties with mortgages tend to be more of a difficult challenge for a fraudster, so they like to find properties that are unmortgaged. They will then be able to identify from the land registry who the registered owners are, and they can then put in motion steps to obtain identity papers and passports which carry the name of the registered proprietor. They then apply generally to get a tenancy of the property using some of their own associates who would be assisting them with the fraud. They will go to the letting agency and take occupation of the property, generally using false identity or false passports for tenants. And they will then pay the rent for approximately 3 months whilst they have an opportunity to find a buyer for the property, and then they will advertise the property for sale to the public, generally through the internet, so that there's no for sale sign outside, and they've got keys to the property they can show people in, and that generally allows them to facilitate a fraud. Well, steps people can take to prevent property fraud, there's a number of things that can be done. The land registry offer a property alert service, and that is something that's really worthwhile signing up to if you are concerned about this sort of issue. So if you own a property that you don't live in, if your property doesn't have a mortgage, or if you're letting out property to tenants and you're concerned that it may be vulnerable. The property alert system will mean that anytime anybody carries out a land registry search against your title, you will get notification, and that can, if it wasn't you doing it, it can put you on notice of anything that's maybe suspicious, and it would probably be worth going down to the property to check out what's happening, speaking to your tenants if you've got people in there, speaking to letting agents who are managing the property for you to make sure that there's nothing untoward going on. Other things that you can do as well is to enter a restriction against the title of the property, because anytime anybody tries to carry out any transactions, the land registry will require them to prove that you've already been given prior notice. And other steps you can take is obviously just to keep an eye on the property, generally go down there, make sure that your address on the land registry is up to date and it's your home address if you're not living at the property, so that you're constantly kept informed and aware of any steps that people may be taking in relation to property that you own. So if you are unfortunate enough to be a victim of a property fraud, then there are certain steps that you can take. Firstly, one would hope that the land registry would contact you and ask you whether or not you've actually agreed to sell this property, because whenever there's a new application for registration of a proprietor, the land registry will seek permission of the existing proprietor before okaying the transfer. So if your address with the land registry is up to date, you should be notified of that. So the first thing to do is simply to protest against any application to register a new proprietor. If the land registry aren't able to communicate with you or don't receive any notification from you, then the land registry will most probably register the new proprietor to the property, and that would mean that the property ownership would pass. In those circumstances, you would need to seek rectification of the title and bring proceedings for that. The alternative is that the land registry you are the person attempting to purchase the property, and you get notified by the land registry that there is another real proprietor out there who doesn't agree to transfer the property into your name. In those circumstances, you are the victim of the property fraud, having paid your money over to purchase the property and not actually receiving any title for the land. Your remedy in that case would potentially lie with the person that you paid the money to, if they can be traced, so the fraudulent seller, but unfortunately as is quite often the case, they tend to abscond pretty quickly out of the country, and it's very difficult to recover the money from them. So you would need to look at possible remedies against the conveyancing solicitors that were involved in the transaction. Your own solicitor has a duty to act with reasonable care and skill in relation to the property transaction and to protect you from this eventuality. If they haven't exercised their duty sufficiently well, then you may have a claim against them in negligence or for breaching their obligations as trustee of the purchase money, which they're only allowed to part with for purposes of valid completion. So that's the sort of steps that I would advise anybody who is in that unfortunate situation to take.